Well, this is another Monday morning. I hope you guys are going to have a good week this week. I know it's kind of early for the ones that are tuning in right after it's released, because I usually release these at 12:05 a.m. on Monday morning. One way or another, I'm remembering some Knuckle Busters and tough jobs that we had to do that they pretty much happened all in one week. And so I'm going to sort of plow through these and see if we can gain some insight from some of this stuff. Make some observations first. We got these people that come in with these laundry lists of stuff that they want done. The dispatcher used to call it a catalog. In other words, you have several work orders. We only had 3 repairs per work order on those computer printed work orders, and so if they had 7 or 8 or 10 repairs, you'd have several work orders stapled together there. And anyway, they'd say, I want all of this stuff fixed that I've been putting off for all these years. Or they'll tell you to say, the vehicle runs bad and I want you to do something about it. And everything you look goes a little deeper and a little deeper and a little deeper. And if you leave anything out and you don't fix everything you find, they're going to come back and claim you didn't do the job right, But, if you get a vehicle in for a simple service, though, and they didn't bring it in for a whole lot of stuff, sometimes a laundry list develops when you start looking at stuff. Loose front end parts, failing brakes, expired tires are worn out, something like that. You can actually wind up creating a really big estimate that will scare the living daylights out of these people. Now, for a while over at the Ford place, we were taught to find whatever we could find and try to, sell the customer on all that stuff. But one of the things that I told the management, I says, if you do this on every car that comes in here, particularly the ones that are a little older that you can actually make some money on that aren't warranty work, everybody is going to all over town be talking about whenever I take my car over there, they're wanting me to spend $500 or $600 on every little thing. And I said, if you don't want to drive your customers away, of course we started doing 29-point inspections or whatever, with the red, yellow, and green flags on each thing. This is something you need, this is something that you can put off for a while, and this is something that's just fine, blah blah, and all that. But a lot of the mechanics didn't like having to fill those things out. One way or another, the laundry list develops itself sometimes, and then sometimes they bring one to you. And some people don't mind spending a lot of money on their car to bring it back up, but some people are just terrified as soon as they hear you say, well, you need $500 or $600 worth of work here that you didn't know you were going to need when you brought it in for this oil change, this kind of thing. Alright, well, somebody's quoted Einstein as saying, if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you probably don't understand it yourself. And what I'm talking about there is, anytime we need to sell somebody a repair, we need to be able to explain to them in detail why that repair is needed, what the consequences are if they don't have it. And I'm not talking about looking at a perfectly good front end that don't even have any busted boots or no slack in any of the parts and trying to sell them $700 or $800 worth of front end work, because that goes on. I know in my area it does. I don't know about anywhere else. But one way or another, we basically need to be able to transparently show them this is what needs to be done. And you can put this off if you want to. This is the possible consequences, and be honest about it. Say, well, the spark plugs are getting a little worn. You're going to get a misfire. It might affect your gas mileage a little bit or something like that. But you don't need to be saying that you shall surely die if you don't get this work done. Unless the brakes are completely haywired and coming apart, and the tires are just about to blow out. But that's just one of the things that we got to be able to communicate. Communication skills are really important here. Now, there are some customers that will look at you and nod their head and won't understand anything you're saying. So sometimes you may communicate it very well and they just don't get it. And you got to be able to get enough feedback from them to see if they understand. As far as that laundry list business goes, I had that one guy, and I'll talk about that probably a little bit later with some illustrations, came in there on an old F-150 that had fuel injection on it. It was in the late 80s. Well, it was 85 or 86 model, I guess, but that was back when they first went fuel injection. But they had a whole bunch of stuff that was wrong with that thing, and I found everything that hadn't been maintained, everything was clogged up, everything needed to be replaced, there were filters and all that. And all of that was straightened out. It idled good, it ran good, it didn't skip anymore. I drove it, it ran just fine. But what I didn't catch was the fuel pump that was in the tank that was feeding the main fuel pump on the frame would come and go. And it gave me a problem. Now, whenever that thing quits, the pump in the tank quits delivering, it's like a windshield washer pump, but it's pumping gas. When it pumps and stops delivering gas to the one on the frame, then the truck tries to lose power and cut out and quit, and the pump on the frame gets noisy and all that kind of stuff. And that never happened when I was test driving it after my repairs, but the guy came back because he picked up on the fact that it was doing this, and he thought we just didn't do our job right, you know. But and that pump wouldn't act up all the time. That's another thing too. But anyway, I kind of got a little crossed up with that guy about that, because he had the idea we sold him a bunch of work that he didn't need, which, goodness gracious, everything under the hood hadn't been touched for a long time. I could go on and on about that. Well, these procrastinators, they take the pathway to trouble that could have been avoided. They're busy drivers that's been putting off us first one repair and then another for thousands of miles, and they decide they want everything handled all at once. A classic example is when the check engine light comes on, somebody at the parts store or somewhere pulls a code for them and says, oh, this isn't a big deal. Or if they decide, I'm just not going to do anything about this right now, and they drive it for another year with that check engine light on, which, unless you've got a misfire, the check engine light only knows how to burn one way. And so whenever they finally bring it in there to get the check engine light seen about, 4 or 5 more problems have stacked up behind the check engine light that can only burn one way. You know, like I say, if you've got a misfire, it'll flash. But typically all this other stuff can go wrong that the check engine light's meant to tell them about. And you know, that's one of the things Mode 6 data is good for, is whenever you go in there and look, it'll give you the minimum and the maximum and how many failures it's had, and it'll flag it if you've got something that's, you know, hasn't yet thrown a code, but it's on the way to doing that. And my Explorer got like 3 or 4 flags like that right now. You know, I think one of the oxygen sensors is getting kind of sluggish and lazy, but it hadn't thrown a code yet. However, Mode 6 data has picked up on it. As I remember, I look at that periodically, because I got Mode 6 data on my radio, you know, through a little ELM 327. Alright, so these happy customers here had a 2005 Pathfinder. They brought us all kinds of work. They would just bring this stuff in, and we would, you know, usually fix everything. You know, toward the end of my tenure as an instructor over there, before I retired, they brought this thing in. You know, we'd worked on it several times, but they brought it in a long time after this, and it was needing an engine. I guess they had run it low on oil or something. But I was basically told them, I says, we're not going to be able to do that, because at the time I didn't have any students I would trust to put an engine in a Nissan Pathfinder and do a good job of it. So I had to turn that job down. But everything else we pretty much did. But most of the work that they brought was really aggravating work. It was hard work. Of course, some of it was really good work, like they brought us a Volkswagen Bug that had a bad water pump on it. We had to put a water pump and a timing belt and all on that. It was an old, it was a new Beetle. It wasn't the old rear engine Bug I'm talking about. This one here, the instrument cluster was doing crazy stuff. The heater core was leaking, but she didn't mention anything except the instrument cluster on the phone. Then when she brings it in, it's, oh, by the way, can you replace the heater core and do an alignment? You know, so she added a little bit of stuff to the laundry list when she brought it in. Well, the temp gauge, the tach, and the speedometer were randomly flatlining and coming back, and the brake, ABS, and VDC warning lights would flash on and off randomly. This is wacky stuff is going on with the instrument cluster. And one thing that we did notice is when this stuff was happening, the cluster couldn't communicate with the scan tool. So I sort of filed that away. I said, well, we'll look at that later. First, let's go ahead and do the heater core. So I gave Thomas the heater core job, and he had to rip the dash out of the thing, get it all took apart and put a heater core in it, which is a real bear. It's not so bad if somebody has done a lot of these, and some heater cores are harder than others, don't get me wrong. This one here was pretty rough. So he managed to make it happen, though. He got the dash all pulled out, and they got to plane them out from under there, and he put the heater core in it, and then he put it all back together. This guy's kind of a little more seasoned than some of my other students. He was in his 30s and military veteran and all that, and he had some grit. Worked his way through that. Okay, so here we go. Here's another one that came in about the same time. 2009 Silverado 2500. Stable to track message. This is a truck that had been badly neglected. TPMS message. Tag lights busted. Center high mount stoplight cargo lamp busted. Driver side door lock switch. 2 dead actuators. Now, it wasn't really all that interesting except for that StabiliTrack message. The diagnostic codes and the troubleshooting led to the replacement of the steering angle sensor. And I don't know if you've seen that steering angle sensor right there was right here. And I had to pull the column out of there and put it in a vise and to change that steering angle sensor out. You know, that was, you know, something of a job to do that. But the guy got some good out of it. We replaced the center high mount stoplight. We found corrosion in the wires where they plugged into the window switch, and that's typically not that uncommon if people have left their windows down just enough to where those switches get wet a bunch. You know, if your power window switches get wet a bunch, you're going to wind up seeing stuff like that on a lot of these vehicles. But the tire monitor system, they didn't even want that fixed. They didn't care about that, but they did want this StabiliTrack fixed, and we put that on there for this. And so that's pretty much. We actually got a couple of universal tag lights for the bumper, and because you can get a traffic ticket. I don't know how it is where you are, but in this part of the country, if your tag lights don't work, they'll pull you over for that. So we replaced the busted cargo lamp assembly. And who breaks one of those things? I mean, that's way up at the top of the, you know, I mean, somebody must have really been hauling something tall back there, or throw a piece of lumber up against it or something like that. But we replaced that too. Alright, so next we have the F-150 2005 model. This was an unusual deal. This guy came walking in and he was wearing all of the stuff you see them wear on SWAT. I mean, he had the full body armor, you know I'm talking about, that said police on the back of it and all that stuff. He looked like he was ready for bear when he came in there, but he brought that truck. The sunroof was open and he couldn't get it closed because it wasn't working, and he had the towel stuffed up there to try to keep the water out of the truck. Well, when I went to look at the VIN number on the truck, somebody, I mean, I'm talking about the one under the glass, the one that had been peeled off the door, and that one that's riveted to the dash under the windshield, that had been busted out of there. I'm talking about somebody had pried that and got, you know, broke the rivets and got that. We didn't have no idea what the VIN number on that vehicle was, and I guess this guy got it from the impound or something, and it might have been a drug runner's truck. I don't know, but he was driving the thing, and somehow he got a tag for it. I don't know how he knew what the serial number was, because I couldn't figure it out. Unless you plugged the scan tool in, you might have been able to pull it out of the engine controller that way. But one way or another, what we found out, you know, the moonroof wouldn't open and close. We looked at that to start with, and I found out that this motor here was bad. This is the motor, and what I did on it was, he didn't want to spend $300 for a motor. It was back there, you know, had to pull the headliner down to get your hands on it. And what I did was I took these bolts out, and I took this motor shell out, and then I could get my fingers on the armature of the motor, and I used my fingers and turned the armature by hand, which moved this gear, which closed the moonroof, closed it all the way up and sealed it up just like it's supposed to. And I told him, I says, you're not going to have a moonroof unless you want us to replace this motor and spend the money on that, and we'd have to initialize it and all that kind of stuff. He says, no, I don't want that. He said, just go ahead and get the moonroof closed. Well, there were other trouble too. We had this under the vehicle. It must have been parked somewhere where there was a fire, because this thing right here had this oddly melted connector. See this connector, how strange that was? All of those wires, it had melted enough to where the wires were kind of all melted together, and that didn't look like it had been done with current or getting too hot. It looked like external source of heat, like fire or something like that, and like a flame had been held under it. The tape was, and insulation were melted, the side of the connector was too, and we could twist and wiggle the connector, and everything that wasn't working right would start working right. So that was what this problem was there. And so basically what we did was, one at a time, we clipped, solder, heat shrink, one wire at a time, got all of those things put together, just taped all that up and made it like a regular wire harness, so it was just like it was supposed to be. Everything was working just like it was done. That was a fairly simple job there. Alright, so this Tacoma was losing coolant, didn't have any visible leaks. I actually posted a picture of this spark plug whenever I was, piddling around with this PowerPoint on my Technical Writer Facebook page, and was asking people, hey, what do you think about this plug? Well, see, this plug right here, with all that intense amount of rust that you're seeing right there, that means that there's been coolant getting in the cylinder. Anytime you see a plug that's that rusty, it's no accident, and a plug should never be that rusty unless there's coolant getting in there and it's oxidizing and attacking the metal. Now, some spark plugs, granted, are going to be material stainless or something that doesn't do this, but if you see a plug that looks like that, then there's a pretty strong indicator that there's coolant or water getting into that cylinder. Usually coolant will put crusty green deposits on the plug too and stuff like that, or depending on what color your coolant is. But what we did there was, the coolant was not going out on the ground, but it was making it into the engine through this way. And so we went ahead, because he didn't want to spend the time for us to put a head gasket on it. It was his hunting truck, which was a secondary vehicle, which he didn't want to spend a lot of money and time on it. So we put some Blue Devil head gasket sealer through there. You got to follow the instructions on that can right to the very letter, which drain all the coolant out, get everything, all the antifreeze and everything out, and you displace this much of the coolant, or not coolant, but of the clear water that you pour back in there with this Blue Devil, and then you fire it up and you let it run, and then you got to just follow the instructions on that thing really good. And a lot of the time, and there was another vehicle that we fixed with this Blue Devil stuff that the girl didn't have the money or the time for us to put a head gasket on it, and it was actually getting water in several of the cylinders, and we ran Blue Devil through hers and sealed it up. But after you get it done, you drain all that stuff out of there and you put coolant and stuff back in it. But you got to let it run for a while. I mean, talk about an hour and get really, really, really good and hot and give this stuff time to work. And then you got to let it set. Drain it and then let it set 24 hours, as I remember. I should have pulled the instructions up. But if you read what's on the back of that can and you do what it says, the way it says. Now, Blue Devil does have another product that you supposedly can just pour in there with your antifreeze and it will still seal it up. But we were using this one here. And it worked really well. He came back about a month later and said he hadn't had to add any more coolant. Of course, we had to replace the spark plugs too, All right, this Lexus wouldn't take gas, and the only reason it wouldn't take gas was, and it may not have been an LS400, it may have been something else, but it was a Lexus, and I just put this Lexus up here for that. And this dirt dauber had built a nest in this part of the evaporative system, and we busted all that junk out of there and blew the dirt out of it and put it back on, and after that it would take gas just fine. So that wasn't really a knuckle buster job, it was just kind of fun, Now this Nissan here, he had to, you might be familiar with this, this hose assembly goes under the hood, and it's got a water pump built onto it to help the heater core get all the coolant it needs. And these plastic fittings, where it connects, are really bad to bust off. I mean, especially when the plastic's been brittle and old and hot. This is $220 part. Now, there was another Nissan like this that we had broke that off, and I actually put pipe threads, up in there and put a fitting to fix that one. But this one here was busted bad enough, we just went ahead and replaced the whole thing, and it goes all the way around the whole engine compartment. Well, filling the thing up with coolant, after we got all this put on there and everything back together and it was like it was supposed to be, we had to jack the thing up on this particular one. It's got a little bitty cap. Let me look at this. It's got that water pump, incidentally, is right over here on this that's made into it. But right up here there's a radiator cap that doesn't have a spring or anything in it. It's just like a cap where you're supposed to fill it up. And then over here on the surge tank bottle, it's got another cap. And so basically what you need to do is take both of those off, take this one off, jack the vehicle up in the front as high as you can jack it up. You can see Thomas there working on it, and add coolant right here until all of that air burbles and burps up out of there, and you wind up with the whole thing full of coolant. If you've got that thing sitting flat on the floor, you might have one of those little vacuum attachment things that you can put coolant in it with, and I've used those too. I got it. They're, you know, I had one of those. But this particular one here, we got it all jacked up really high and managed to make this the highest place on the system, and all the air got out and we got it bled out and everything worked really good. But we jacked it up and made it happen. Okay. Now the Pathfinder, same vehicle, I had this alignment issue. So we were going to loosen this nut right here. There was a nut here, and we were going to make an adjustment on the rear first. When you're doing an alignment, if it's got four-wheel alignment, you set the back ones first before you set the front ones. Go to the back ones, get them lined up first, and then do the front. Well, while we were trying to do the back ones, this doggone thing busted off, and this bolt wouldn't even turn. So basically we had to cut the bolt off. That's the other end of this that you're looking at right there, and that still wasn't good enough, so we actually had to get a you know, abrasive cutting disc put on the skill saw that I keep around for that reason, and we cut the old lower control arm off, and we put a new one on there, and that way we were able to do an alignment. See, we got some nice eccentrics on here and all that, so we can do the alignment adjustments and that kind of thing. But that was just something that was a kind of a knuckle buster. You know, sometimes you feel like, oh, this is, you know, piece of cake. This is no problem. This job here is going to be real easy. It wasn't. Okay, now this 2009 F-150 was a really interesting thing. I said it wouldn't go in reverse sometimes. It sticks in third gear sometimes. And a regular shop had found debris in the transmission oil pan, but really didn't know what needed to be done next. So they sent it to us. And they did say clearing the codes help. Now, I do, anytime you've got one that's where the transmission starts acting crazy and you clear the codes and it cleans up its act, and this has been true a long time, or as long as there's been electronic automatic transmissions, that's typically a problem with the controller. Typically. It'll be a software issue, or, you know, some trash data gets stored in there or something like that. And so, here we go. So, I pulled a TR sensor code. I mean, I think I put a different truck on that first slide, the one that I used earlier, but pulled a TR sensor code, didn't get anything else. Duplicated the problem a time or two. Checked with one of my graduates who was working at a Ford place, and he does these 6R80s all the time. And he says, typically what that is the lead frame, you know. And I says, okay, so if the lead frame is this thing right here. Let me look at that. This right here is the lead frame. Right here, see that? And the lead frame actually contains speed sensors and other things, and the transmission controller is built into this thing. And so that's kind of what it looks like when you've taken it off of there. But that particular, you had to pull the valve body off to get it out of there. And so that really, you know, first time I'd run into one of these. Interestingly enough, too, when you add the fluid back to this, it's got a little very short filler tube. It's only about 5 or 6 inches long, and a little short dipstick that you have to be under the truck to fill this transmission up. Right there by the hot exhaust. That was brilliant. I don't know what Ford was thinking about when they did that. But anyway, so while we had the valve body off, we noticed that this adapter was busted. So I called my buddy Jimmy over there that had originally given us the information. Hey, Jimmy, you know this thing right here? Oh, yeah. He said, sometimes that happens. He said, whenever I'm working on a transmission and I'm going to replace that anyway, I always save the old one if it's okay. And so on the way home, I stopped by the Ford place, and you know, he gave me one of these, and we replaced this busted one with this good one right here. Now, I will tell you, if you've got something like this going on, this is really dangerous for the torque converter, because it can pull air, this busted adapter here, it can pull air in through this crack right here. And when air gets pulled in through that crack, it goes into the torque converter, and the torque converter is like a centrifuge, so that the fluid goes to the outside, the air goes to the inside. There's no lubrication where the air is, and it burns up the torque converter because somebody didn't mount the filter or the valve body right way. This is really dangerous stuff right here. Well, anyway, we replaced that, put one on there, and kind of a perfect storm. So this, my guy decides to help out. He calls the parts department, asks if they had a lead frame. 125 bucks is all it was. So the way it went down was a perfect storm because the year model was lost somewhere in the process. And when we pull the valve body to replace the lead frame, it was exactly the same. I mean, it looked really good. There was no problem there as far as it fitting and all. So when we put it on there, see, there's the old one, and we put that one on here just like it was supposed to go. It looked the same and everything. Put it on there, torqued the valve body with the torque wrench and all that, and it wouldn't engage. Now, for years when I was in the field, we were told by Ford that electronics will not cause a no engagement problem. Well, that's hooey anymore. Because on this one here, whenever this transmission controller, which is basically what this is, you know, this is the one that was laying aside. I think that's the new one before we put it on the valve body. But this thing right here, with the transmission computer built into it, when that thing goes dark, whenever you disconnected power to the transmission, the pressure, the control pressure would go really high. So it would apply the clutches really hard. So it would always pull off. It would just shift super hard, you know, so that, but on this one here, whenever that goes dark, there's no pressure. In other words, the pressure goes the other way. Now, I don't know whose idea that was, but it looked the same. And furthermore, it wouldn't engage. It wouldn't talk to the IDS. We had the Ford's IDS. It absolutely would not communicate. But I could disconnect the wires, which plug in from the outside, and plug the old lead frame in and let it swing by the wires, and the IDS would talk to that lead frame. So I said, well, this is very weird, very, very strange. But I discovered, as we did research with the parts department over there, that you can't buy a lead frame for a 2009 model without buying the whole valve body, which is $1,000. And even though the later lead frames look identical, they're replaceable separately. In other words, if it had been like a 2012, you could just replace the lead frame and it would have been just fine. But you could not buy the lead frame separately for an 09 model. So we got the whole valve body, put it on there, torqued it, did the fluid fill, fixed the truck, you know. And so that was a learning experience for me because I hadn't dealt with one of these before. But it was a victory in the end. We made it happen. We were overthinking the Nissan cluster issue. I mean, I did these, you know, looked at all of all the wiring, everything, checking the network, doing the, basically pulling the modules loose while I watched all this network stuff going on using the picoscope. And we didn't really see anything conclusive, but it turned out that all we needed to do to fix this, and this is usually not the case it seems like, but all we needed to do to fix this one was replace the cluster. We replaced the cluster. Seemed like we got a used one from somewhere. Popped it on there, and as I remember, it was plug and play, so there wasn't any reprogramming that had to be done on that. But that took care of that, and so that was our little bunch of Knuckle Busters. There's one more here. This old Asian car, I can't remember what kind of car it was. It belonged to the culinary arts instructor, and it was making bumping and thumping noises. I was going to replace this bushing, and that bushing, this bolt that goes, you know, you see how this has spread out? Well, when I started trying to take that bushing out of there, the entire bushing was turning with the bolt because that sleeve in the middle had seized against the bolt. And there was no way you could get that to not, you know, to turn. If you're turning the whole thing, and basically it you know, tried to push this apart, you know, with that bolt. So basically what we had to do was have to cut that, and we had to cut everything out of there and, you know, get it out. Then I tried to start trying to get one of these bushings. There wasn't one. Couldn't get one. Not available anywhere. And so I got the measurements of this thing and measured it precisely, you know, the length and all that kind of stuff. And I sent this over to the parts store. So my buddy over there that was working there then, he was really a good parts man. And he found a bushing that was the same it had all the same dimensions, except maybe this was too long. I can't remember what exactly had to be changed, but I managed to replace that bushing with one that I had tailored from a bushing that was close enough to the same size. I mean, this hole going through here was the same size and everything, and so that was a happy fix, because this guy wound up, you know, able to drive his car a little bit more. It was an old Asian car that you couldn't even get parts for anymore. That pretty well winds us up today, and I want you guys to have a really good week, and I hope you'll really be careful out there. And until next time, I'll see you later.